Mad World. Written and read by Huw Carr. Original story idea by Gwen Carr. Directed by Brenden James. Larry woke up in the morning to find the world had really gone mad. He shook his head. There had been many occasions before in the past when he or his friends and family had used the phrase before. In 1945, when the first nuclear bombs were dropped on Japan, Larry was not quite 8 years old. His father had been working on a homemade replica of a Lancaster bomber in the garage, carefully shaping the propellers to have it ready for Larry's birthday at the end of the following month. His father had come into the house for 4 o'clock tea and biscuits, his thin and bony nose covered with a fine stippling of wood dust, holding the Sydney Morning Herald. Larry still remembered the words that made the headline on the left-hand side column: "Atomic bomb on Japan, huge blast effect." And the first words that came from his often silent father's mouth: "The world's gone mad." What his father had meant, and practically everyone else meant by that phrase, was that select groups of people in power had done baffling or terrifying things. This was not what Larry was experiencing. His world, everything that filled it, the objects that they possessed and had shaped around him, even the powers that controlled the passage of the day, had given up on the eon-long struggle to remain sane and fallen headlong into horrifying and relentless insanity. He had gone to sleep in his warmly toned bedroom, the walls covered by bronze wallpaper that he had hung shortly after his wife Judy had given birth to their third son Darren. It had been a dark and wet autumn, and he had worried through the entire process of preparing the walls, pasting them, and applying the long rolls of paper that Judy would cancel the project and make him return to the factory to hunt for another, lighter pattern. She hadn't, and the print of interlocking fronds of golden brown ferns had festooned the bedroom for 40 years. But in the space of the night, he had awoken to find the walls were stripped of the comforting color and replaced with a stark, unfamiliar off-white. That wasn't all. The roof had been raised. The bedroom walls, the window within it, and its relation to the ceiling had perfectly conformed with the dimensions of the golden ratio. It had been relaxingly long, its climb broken by a wooden skirting that ran at the same height as the curtain mountings. Now the walls were taller, making the shadows from the 2 squat window mottle the ceiling with cast patterns that looked like decay. One picture alone had adorned the wall, a medium-sized print of John William Waterhouse's Lady of Shalott, her scarlet dress still vivid after. How many years had it been hanging there? He stopped and considered. On second thoughts, he did not think it was scarlet. Perhaps it was dark blue, or maybe a more pure white than these awful walls. It had been hanging on his wall over his wife's walnut vanity only yesterday. Now it had been replaced by 2 paintings in portrait aspect, standing beside one another and scowling like suspicious policemen. Inside the bland mounts, hideous colors circled about a distorted face that one minute seemed to be a cartoon lion sitting upright and smugly proud of his manicured mane, and the next moment a golden-faced jester who had cross-hatched his idiot face with a black marker. A voice spoke. Larry moved his vision away from the paintings, even as they began to change again, and saw a plump man sitting close to his bed. "You may be dead, but you aren't peeling," the man mumbled, and stared at him with dark eyes beneath brows that shadowed his sockets into 2 gaping holes. "What are you doing in my room?" Larry asked, trying above all else to stop from screaming. He had known the world was on the brink of going entirely and completely mad. It had not suddenly happened and surprised him. Little things happened first. He had been in the kitchen with Judy one day, helping to wash up after Sunday roast. They'd invited the 2 foreign exchange students that had visited their church that weekend to come back and share their lamb joint, complete with Judy's light-as-a-cloud Yorkshire puddings and thick gravy not made from a packet, but from the juices of the pan. Both he and Judy had struggled with their names due to how quietly the students spoke. Pausing to remember them, the names slipped away like soap that had fallen into the bathwater. One was Ban or Ran or something similar, and the other, from what Larry had been able to catch, sounded like he had said Tom Soup. The young men had given up on relating their names after 2 or 3 goes in quick succession. As they sat around the coffee table, and the 2 young men had smiled, bobbed their heads at his and his wife's questions, and lapsed finally into a strange, confrontational silence, Larry had noticed that one of the men had changed the color of his skin. He had originally been the leather-like brown of someone who was used to life of a field worker. Even though his teeth were a pale yellow, somewhat stained in the gaps by what Larry suspected was cigarette smoking, the coffee color of his skin had made his teeth seem white. Yet as they held the cups of tea that Judy had offered, one of the men changed quickly, his complexion flushing with a bright tomato-colored redness. It was not a blushing red, or even the ruddiness that darkens a face in the peak of anger. It was as if his face had suddenly been turned inside out, and the red, raw blood had bubbled up from beneath. That alone had not been enough to worry him. If that had been all, he would have assumed the man was having some type of stroke or some other sudden medical emergency. What made him afraid was the fact that the man's friend and Judy sat there in silence, seeing the man's face distort into a blistering redness, and had done nothing. He had not dreamed it. He knew this because later that night he had dreamed. The dream took him back to the sunroom in his parents' house. He was a boy again, in shorts and grey school shirt, sitting behind the coffee table his father had made. It was the same coffee table that the students had sat at when the grotesque redness had transformed one of them. Within the dream, his mother had stood on the opposite side of the coffee table, bending forward and looking down at him. With despair, he had watched her face darken and her pale features bloom into the same hideous redness, as if blood was building up beneath the skin and pooling there. At the point it looked like her face would burst, and the rivers of red would spurt out. She screamed and began to chase him. Around and around the coffee table she pursued him until he ran for the front door and broke out into a street empty of cars. He had run up the street with his mother's scream behind him. It grew and grew as she gained on him, growing more bestial and alien as she approached. When she was almost clutching at his shoulders, her shriek became the wailing of the alarm. He was left that morning with the fog of the receding dream turning pale and insubstantial in his mind, while the reality of the student's nightmarish face remained. That was the first time he noticed it. As the days marched on, little moments of weirdness continued to disturb his day. At first, there would be spaces of time, sometimes weeks, when he thought the assaults on the sanity of the world around him had finally come to an end. But then he might walk into the salmon-colored bathroom and see the bath had collected a shallow puddle of murky, sludge-filled water, within which were crawling a collection of dragon-like lizards, their drooping skin shining like an armored knight's mail. The meal that Judy served him might sit dormant on the plate, as a meal should, perfect in its stillness. Yet as his fork speared the portion of the meat, it would open a hitherto unseen eye and stare hatefully at his assault. Through it all, he had attempted to understand it, to discuss it with Judy or friends from church, so that the occurrences didn't overwhelm him. He explored all avenues. His doctor calmly assured him that the chief thing he feared wasn't so, that he wasn't going mad. No, Dr. Hicks was very clear on that front. Larry wasn't mad. Was he dead? The thought had crossed his mind. Considering the amount of time Larry had spent hearing about the afterlife, and the myriad of opinions surrounding it, he had grown no closer in his long life to having a definitive opinion on what awaited him after he had shuffled off. Ministers murmured serenely about the bliss of the great, undiscovered country that awaited them all. But after the local pastor of 40 years was hastily removed from his office, after his activities with a 17-year-old boy who had been his neighbor were discovered, Larry began to strongly doubt that he and his pastor held the same ideas as to what bliss was, let alone agreed on a vision of life after death. So Larry set up an experiment. Working on the consensus model of Protestants, Larry assumed that the end of life coincided with a release of the spirit, whatever that might be. To achieve immortality, one would have to leave behind a fully mortal body. So, if he was in a state of post-life, the body he was using had to be as imperishable as his spirit. Therefore, he had walked down the road to the corner supermarket and bought himself some matches. With all the appliances in the kitchen being electric, he had no need for them, and both he and Judy had long since given up the fad of lighting perfumed candles, since the kids had grown up and left, and his asthma had grown far worse. Returning home with a small red box, topped with a cheeky redhead whose hair was aflame, he held a cluster of 6 or more matches together, struck them along the side of the box, and waited for the hissing fire to ignite all the heads, before ramming them into the side of his forearm. The resulting pain and the throbbing wound that had taken weeks to heal convinced him that he was still occupying a living, fragile body. Although he was satisfied that he discounted the idea that he was dead, he was frustrated that he had not taken into consideration the fact that after he had touched the smouldering match heads to his flesh, that he might drop them. What began as a test of his mortality almost ended with him literally lighting the means to bring about the end of him, as the pain caused him to drop the burning matches onto the lounge chair on which he had been sitting. Years ago, he had resurfaced the leather of the lounge himself to save money on it being done professionally or buying a new suite. He had been very proud of the job that he had done. The fallen matches had tumbled down the side of the cushion and started a small blaze, which he had put out with the cup of coffee that was thankfully close at hand. Judy had, of course, not seen the experiment in the same way that he had, nor had she understood, as he did, the significance of it. It was almost as if the force or forces that had been quietly working away to successfully drive the world mad had become aware through Larry's humble experiment that their secret efforts had now been exposed, and so gave up on the clandestine operation and went full hell for leather instead. Shortly after that, the house had first begun to rearrange itself. Larry could not be sure whether his home was the true ground zero of the epidemic that rapidly infected everything in their neighborhood, or whether he had simply been the first to become inoculated against it, if he, in fact, was. Through the walls, he heard a pervasive buzzing of indefatigable, disembodied voices, droning on in a spirit-sapping dreariness. More painfully, he felt the way the strangeness was penetrating even into his own body, numbing his hands and feet so that he could barely hold a pen now or walk without shuffling. As each new strangeness took hold, he wondered whether anyone else would wake against it. It was, with sadness, that he realized that was how corruption worked. It had begun seeping in sometime in the generation after the war. Spirits had been high in the 50s. The future was branching out towards a limitless horizon. The nations that had been on the winning side of the conflict were treated to unparalleled luxuries. Larry remembered the restrictive diets of the rationing years, giving way in time to fresh peaches and pineapple, jelly crystals with real thick cream, as much bread as his belly could want, smothered with jam or hundreds and thousands, such as at a birthday lunch. Barbecues brimmed over with fat sausages, sizzling lamb chops and salads bright with the newest garnish from faraway places filled the faces of never-famished children. Silver spaceships raced across the blinking box of the telescreen with heroes ever ready to fight for the rights of the expanding human race, bringing with them gleaming gadgets and the dominance of the American accent. So the children of that age never saw that nestled down deeply among it all was a goat-headed madness, quietly hooting a piper's tune until all the faces of the things that man had fashioned together joined in one exultant, discordant and inhuman song. "We'll take your hide and call it pork," said the man before the paintings, rising off of the chair beside Larry's bed and scooping cold hands beneath his forearm. "No," Larry called out. His voice was weak and sounded very dry. "I don't want to. You can't make me. I'll call my son. I'll call all my sons. They'll..." Before he could say any more, two spindly, pale blue shapes spun into the room and came to rest beside the man. They seemed to sense that Larry wanted to resist. At first, a gleam of hope arose in him that they had come to defend him. Perhaps they would beat back this Cheshire cat of a man who grinned in a way that made his open mouth sag and the teeth within quiver like restless, slimy things with legs on a rippling seabed. Then, to his despair, they paired on either side of the Cheshire cat man, using their own smooth hands to heave him up into his slippers and down into a wheelchair. Humiliation welled up inside him. The world might be mad, but he still remembered his dignity. He had been a strong man. Once, on one family holiday, he had walked with Judy up the path up to the jaws of death in the Grampians National Park. The boys had raced around from dawn till the late afternoon, but with the combination of sun and their own excitement, they one by one had run out of steam before they reached the top. To Judy's amazement, he had allowed Nicholas, the eldest, to go a piggyback, while at the same time carrying both John and Darren under each arm. None of the boys were small. He had been their Superman, shield and protector that day. Where were they now? Beyond all else, he clung to the thought that they had not succumbed to the madness. Where was Nick? Where was John? Where was... The Cheshire Cat Man succeeded in planting him in the wheelchair. Larry looked up at him. He could see clearly now that he was a cook. His face was broad and thick in the jowls. "You look like you eat as much as you cook," he said, and smiled defiantly. "Blotchy damned," the man said, and presented his hands before his face. Both seemed to have changed into jungle animals. Although their large, staring eyes rolled maniacally, there was something comforting about them. What he had first mistaken to be a wild, vermin-like creature with an insane expression of a Saturday morning cartoon character became, as the seconds passed, to more closely resemble a fat tabby cat. He had once had a tabby like that. It had been the first that he and Judy had owned, back in the 60s when they were first married. After the end of a long, hard day in the warehouse, or later in the office when he became foreman, he would look forward to two things to end the night: laying between his wife's long, shapely legs, and having a happy cat purring in his lap and slowly blinking. The hand cat had disappeared, and Larry was being pushed along to the door of his changed bedroom. Before they passed through, he saw a colourful piece of paper on a side table. Next to it was a series of blanched photographs. Some of the blue shapes moved to scoop them up. Larry was about to protest when they offered the photographs to him. He reached out to receive them. The photographs became insubstantial and slipped through his fingers, tumbling into his lap as he was wheeled out of the room. The front hall had changed too. It stretched away in front of him, the front door seeming to recede into an impossibly distant horizon, in much the same way as the ground did in Alfred Hitchcock's masterpiece, Vertigo. He had loved that film. Judy and he had seen it together in 1958, and he had been obsessed for years with attempting to discover how the disorientating vertigo effect had been achieved. It seemed obvious now that the house had set out on the same puzzle and worked it out before him. As they approached the front door, Larry looked down at his hands. He did not like the leering, malevolent face that had begun to form within its frame. "How old they have made my hands look," he said inside, as he stared at the worm tunnels of veins on the back of his workman's hands. Once he had been proud of them. They were large, strong, and ever ready to challenge a friend in an arm wrestle. Now, someone had made a cast over his once iron-like grip and baked the cast until it was withered and dry. They had cut off his hands as he slept and fitted him with these horrible, brittle imitations. What else would they cut off next? What part of his body or mind would be sliced away as punishment for seeing the madness clearly and not giving way to it? Perhaps there was no afterlife at all. Or hell had grown tired of waiting for its playthings to torment. The rules may have been changed, and hell was now free to flood out from the underworld below and drown the world. Perhaps Hieronymus Bosch, in painting the third panel of the Garden of Earthly Delights, had seen the future too clearly. He realized that in all his years of religious upbringing, he had rejected the notion that a loving God could sanction torture. No, not just torture, eternal torture without cease. It seemed back then, when the world was still sane, an insane notion. Sudden dread came upon him, like insects crawling up over the back of his head, seeking for his eyes. Had we humans, with our ignorant delusion of holding two totally contradictory ideas at the center of our being, that of the pursuit of a land of eternal love and an equal, eternal depravity of spirit, allowed our ideas to infect the world and drive it mad? Humankind was, as far as we knew, the only being to hold consciousness. We used it to shape the world around us. Had the world been learning from us too well? Had it finally surrendered to reality TV, entertainment news, the impersonal communication, and living through next year's newest model phone? The I want it all now. Give it to me now, 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 mine. Had 3 generations of growing apathy finally allowed the powerful to rape without conscience the innocence of the future, and in doing so, break the world's mind? Outside his front door should have been his front garden, but it wasn't. Instead, they were on the street that led to the beach house in Summers, where they used to holiday in the 70s and 80s. Every time they had gone there, the street had been almost empty. Now, he was free of the Cheshire Catman and walking towards a long series of trestle tables that had been set out, end to end in the street. They were covered with white cloths and paper plates, plastic cups and jugs of red punch floating with melon and other delights. He recognized few of the faces that sat about, laughing and scoffing the party food. His eyes were drawn instead by the flap of hanging tablecloth that opened beneath the table and the pale, dark-haired face that looked out from beneath. The face grinned and a hand waved. Larry got down on his knees and crawled to join the boy beneath the table. For some reason, there were dozens of banana peels beneath the table. The boy held one in his hands and stretched it like an elastic band. Then he aimed at the assorted legs under the table. There was a snap, slap as it collected with flesh, and an angry voice barked comically from above, raging with impotence. Larry laughed along with the boy and found his own laugh was high and golden sounding. It reminded him of all the summers spent playing in rock pools and turning brown and berry-like under the loving sun. Scooping up his own banana whip, he joined the boy in making a chorus of yelps all along the table. Some women had exposed their painted toes in sandals, so he delighted in aiming carefully at their little pink appendages and lashing them. He snorted at the girlish screams and the way their bottoms jiggled in their seats as they stamped at imagined ants and their skirts rode up to reveal their colourful knickers. "Watch this," his new friend said, as he aimed not at legs, but what bunched between them. As the lash struck home and a high howl warbled, both boys clutched at each other and laughed until their grubby faces were lined with tears. They swatted at new targets, each more hilarious than the last, until hands sought them under the table, and they, giggling all the way, darted out again from beneath the table and off into the salt bush scrub and stunted pines beside the road. Larry felt the boy drape an arm over his shoulders in the posture of an old friend. He noticed that he was only a tiny bit smaller than the boy. His new old friend grinned and then, as suddenly as a sea storm, sank his face into seriousness. "I'm going to get you away from this, from all of this. The end is coming soon." From beyond the trees, the sky was darkening. "From where?" Larry asked, though deep inside he felt he knew. "From the madness," came the boy's reply. His eyes seemed to be filled with an anguish that his age shouldn't show. Looking back at the tables and the party, he found the street was almost empty. One smaller child, maybe a year younger than them, was riding his billy cart in the growing gloom. "It's getting dark," Larry said, concerned that he might get in trouble for being out so late. "Have you had your tea yet?" As if he hadn't heard, the boy looked over his shoulder. The arm around Larry's shoulders stiffened and then quickly withdrew. Larry turned to look in the direction that the boy was. In the now dim evening light, Larry could see an old man, dressed in what he considered to be a traditional butler's attire, was approaching. He waved white-gloved hands at them in anxious, frightened ways. "I've found you at last," the old man said. As he spoke, a single light switched on. It was not in the beach house, which which was as black inside as if it had been abandoned for a decade. It was in a small outhouse attached to the side. A door was open, and the single naked electric bulb illuminated dark wooden walls. Clasping his hands together beneath his chin, the old butler spoke. "Your father has come back," he said, in a voice that was not full of hope. It was hesitant, hiding something. "After all these years, he's come back. He wants to see you. Now." "Where has my father been?" he found himself asking inside. Then he remembered. There was the war with bombs and fire and burning flesh dropping from bones. "I'll help to get you out," said his friend at his side, and he was being pushed by the old man closer and closer to the open door. Inside, a tall, heavy man dressed in a suit of ragged black that barely seemed to fit him was standing with his back turned. His bald head gleamed with the light of the naked bulb. He seemed to be standing and facing the only object in the shallow room, a long grey mirror, and although he was completely bald, he was inexplicably drawing a comb over his naked head. Like a tiny child again, Larry was struck by the indescribable terror of an adult with a hidden face. Why was such a hideous game played with babies when a parent would cover their face and the little tot was left with fingers like bars, turning the beloved face into a prison of darkness? Did not every helpless child fear for a moment that when that face was again revealed, it would be a cadaverous, snarling ghoul with wolf teeth and blind eyes? "Don't turn," Larry pleaded in his mind, but he knew that his father, would turn. And he was turning. The pinched, too tight skin at the back of the head moved as the body turned, and before Larry could close his eyes, the broken face, the face that human violence had smashed into a thing that was forced to insanely grin and stare, turned and showed that a face could live on even though it had been destroyed. "Smear the dead with gravel," came a voice behind him. Larry thrust himself away from his father and towards the voice, the cook, the Cheshire Cat man. He was there. "Smear the dead with gravel," he said again. But this time, his face was obscured by Larry's tears. "Sammy's dead. It's Baron. It's me, Dad. It's Darren." Darren looked into the eyes of Larry, his father, whose tears streamed down his anguished face. He turned to the nurse who stood nearby, patient and smiling in her pale blue uniform. She was pushing another wheelchair-bound patient of the hospice who, when he could be understood at all, generally only repeated phrases that harkened back to his days as a prisoner of war. Darren had shared biscuits and coffee with that man's daughter on his last visit, and learned that the man had survived 2 years in an internment camp in Vietnam. The hardest thing for the daughter was that his dementia had chosen to imprison him back there again. Darren had lain down the 2 glove puppets that he'd been carrying. His dad had, for a moment, seemed to have liked one, the one that looked like the grey tabby cat. His dad was always fond of cats. For a little moment, he had laughed, and Darren had seen the father he knew again. Now Larry had returned to the old, grey man that he barely recognized. The man with pitiful eyes that spoke of a lifetime of memories snatched away, but a mind that could still feel the horror and sorrow of the loss. He clenched his jaw. There were so many ways to die. But losing one's memories, one's essential self, before the body finally stopped, seemed too cruel a fate for anyone. Whatever his father's failures through life, he didn't deserve to die, stripped bare one cherished moment at a time. The discarded photos lay in Larry's lap, where he had let them fall. Carefully, Darren reached down and selected one of him and his brothers sitting together on a dune with a sapphire sea behind. He held it to his face in front of his weeping father. "See?" he said, pointing at his child self in the photo, then at his own face. "See, Dad? It's Darren. It's me." Try as Darren might, inside his father's head, Larry's own heartbeat had become the sound of booted, marching feet, as the strange ones hastened to throw gravel on the smeared and soon-to-be-buried faces of the dead. This edition of the Black Dog Chronicles is now available on Bandcamp. You can be the first to own this story and more. Please support our channel by purchasing a copy and telling your friends. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Press the notification bell to be up to date with every new story. And as always, look out for the monsters.